You know what's strange? An entire generation did everything they were told and still feels like they somehow failed. They studied, they went to college, they worked harder, longer hours, with more degrees than the generation before them, and yet they can't afford the life that used to be considered normal. Not luxury, normal. That's not a personal failure, that's a psychology experiment no one signed up for. I'm talking about millennials, people born between 1981 and 1996. And before you roll your eyes and think, here we go again, stay with me, because once you actually look at what shaped this generation, their anxiety starts to make uncomfortable sense. Millennials were raised on a very specific promise. You're special, you can be anything. Hard work guarantees success. That message didn't come from arrogance, it came from the self-esteem movement of the 80s and 90s. Parents genuinely believed that if kids felt confident enough, the world would reward them. But here's where psychology steps in. When expectations are inflated before reality is understood, disappointment doesn't feel like disappointment, it feels like personal failure. In 2020, the Pew Research Center confirmed something historic. Millennials became the first generation in modern American history expected to be worse off financially than their parents. That means you've got millions of people walking around with two conflicting beliefs in their heads at the same time. I was told I'm exceptional, and my life feels incredibly fragile. That mental tension has a name: cognitive dissonance, and millennials live in it daily. College used to be a ladder. For millennials, it became a gamble with guaranteed cost and uncertain return. Degrees stopped being a competitive advantage and became a basic requirement just to enter the job market. Entry-level jobs demanded years of experience, and student loans quietly replaced what houses used to cost. So now you've got people in their late 20s, 30s, even early 40s who did everything right and still feel behind. Psychologically, this creates learned helplessness. When effort no longer feels connected to outcome, motivation doesn't disappear overnight, it slowly rots. This is where millennials get misunderstood. Psychologist Jean Twenge studied this generation and found something that sounds contradictory at first. Millennials score higher on narcissism scales than previous generations, but they also score higher on anxiety and depression. That's not arrogance, that's identity pressure. When you're raised to believe you must be exceptional to be worthy, failure doesn't just hurt, it threatens who you think you are. So you get people who look confident online and quietly feel worthless offline. A trauma response with a LinkedIn profile. Now add social media into the mix. Millennials didn't grow up with it as kids, they grew into it as teenagers and young adults, right when their identities were still forming. Facebook launched in 2004, Instagram in 2010. That means millennials learned how to be adults while learning how to perform adulthood for an audience. Psychologist Tim Kasser's research shows that when people tie their self-worth to external validation, mental health drops. And social media is literally a machine designed to turn your life into a performance. You're not just living anymore, you're documenting, comparing, optimizing. You're running a constant campaign for your own existence, and the polls never close. On top of that, millennials are delaying or skipping traditional adult milestones: marriage, homeownership, kids, not because they don't want them, but because the math doesn't work. Surveys consistently show they still want these things. They just can't access them without family wealth or extraordinary luck. So you end up with a generation stuck in a psychological waiting room. Not young, not settled, just suspended. Psychologists call the stress from prolonged uncertainty allostatic load. It's when your body stays in a state of readiness for a future that never arrives, like being stuck on the loading screen of your own life, watching the progress bar refuse to move. Millennials were also sold a very specific social contract: study hard, go to college, get a job, work your way up. That contract worked for a long time until it didn't. College costs exploded, job security disappeared, pensions vanished, gig work replaced stability. When reality violates your deepest assumptions about how the world works, psychologists call it schema disruption. And when it happens on a generational scale, it changes how people relate to institutions, authority, and the future itself. That's why millennials often seem both idealistic and deeply cynical at the same time. They believe things should be fair, they just no longer believe they will be. This also explains the job hopping stereotype. Millennials get criticized for being disloyal to companies, but corporate loyalty disappeared first. Mass layoffs became normal. Contract work replaced careers. Benefits became optional. Millennials didn't invent instability, they adapted to it. That's not entitlement, that's pattern recognition. There's another side people don't talk about enough. Millennials are one of the most educated and diverse generations in history. They grew up with the internet, which trained them to see multiple versions of truth depending on who's telling the story. That creates a mindset that questions systems instead of blindly trusting them. And people who question broken systems often get labeled difficult. The mental health conversation also changed with millennials. They're the first generation to openly talk about anxiety, depression, and therapy without treating them as character flaws. That's huge. But they're doing this while living in conditions that are objectively more stressful than previous generations. Student debt that would have been unthinkable before. Housing costs that outpaced wages. Job insecurity baked into the system. So they're more self-aware, but also more overwhelmed. Understanding why you're drowning doesn't stop the water. And then there's the future. Millennials are the generation that gets to watch the planet actively deteriorate while being told they're responsible for fixing it, despite having less power and fewer resources to do anything meaningful at scale. Existential dread paired with helplessness is a brutal combination. So when people ask why millennials are anxious, exhausted, or disillusioned, the answer isn't weakness, it's context. They were shaped by impossibly high expectations, economic instability, constant performance pressure, delayed adulthood, and overlapping crises. The psychology of millennials becomes predictable when you look at what they've actually been through. They're responding exactly how humans respond when the ground shifts beneath them and the map they were given no longer matches the territory. If this hit home for you, subscribe. And if you want to support these deep dives, hit the join button and become a channel member. I genuinely appreciate you being here.